The United Nations has called for a temporary humanitarian truce between Libya's warring parties. This to allow emergency services to reach the wounded and help civilians to move out of the conflict zones.
Our humanitarian colleagues on the ground report that the escalation of violence in and around Tripoli has caused the displacement of some 3,400 people fleeing from fighting and has blocked emergency services from reaching casualties and civilians. Fighting has also damaged electricity lines. Clashes with heavy weapons are affecting residential areas, and an unknown number of civilians are unable to flee these locations. We're calling for a temporary humanitarian truce to allow for the provision of emergency services and the voluntary passage of civilians, including those wounded from the areas of conflict.
Earlier, an airstrike forced the closure of the country's only functioning airport. Some reports suggest that the attack at Tripoli's international airport was carried out by the Libyan National Army. At least 25 people have been killed so far, with 80 wounded as a result of fighting in the south of the capital. And the head of Libya's Eastern Parliament, Aguila Saleh, said the battle in Tripoli was aimed at expelling the armed forces that have, quote, kidnapped the capital. Last week, the Libyan National Army, led by Khalifa Haftar, advanced west of Tripoli as battles for the capital have been ongoing for days.
Therefore, in implementation of the constitutional declaration and the parliamentary decision to vacate the capital from the armed groups, and in accordance to the political agreement that states that these militias are kidnapping the capital, the Libyan National Army moved to the capital for one target, that is to expel these armed groups who have kidnapped the capital.
Meanwhile, a protest was held in Tripoli against the troops loyal to Khalifa Haftar. The protesters condemned Haftar and his army, describing it as a group of war criminals bent on installing a military rule. The Russian foreign minister has blamed the NATO alliance for the current crisis while visiting Egypt. Sergei Lavrov said the bloc's 2011 campaign in Libya resulted in terrorism, illegal immigration, and other issues. Lavrov has since called for increased efforts by the UN Security Council to launch a peace dialogue between the rival parties.
We call on all Libyan parties to start a dialogue without preconditions. We are still in contact with the Libyan forces, with Major General Khalifa Haftar and with Prime Minister al-Sarraj, and we express our concern to the UN Security Council about this crisis and war against the Libyan army. And we call for an end to these clashes and parties to start negotiating.
Our correspondent in Syria, Hisham Wanous, brings us more details.
The Libyan Health Ministry has said at least 32 people have died, with dozens injured during a clash between the Libyan National Army, also known as the LNA, and the military of the Government of National Accord. Troops loyal to the Government of National Accord began a military operation against the LNA, led by Khalifa Haftar, after he started airstrikes in Tripoli on Sunday. In an operation that began last Thursday, Haftar's troops said the airstrikes targeted armed groups and their military equipment in Tripoli. In response, the Government of National Accord said they started the Rage volcano operation to free several Libyan cities. It also commenced airstrikes against Haftar's military bases on Sunday. The UN mission in Libya demanded a ceasefire so civilians could be evacuated. However, those involved in the conflict ignored the appeals. The US has since condemned the clashes, saying it will relocate its troops. The UN Security Council failed to stop the escalation of violence in the area, since Russia rejected the resolution, saying it did not include all those involved in the conflict. The Arab League, along with regional countries, have called for a resolution to the conflict, but they have not had any luck yet.
We thank Hisham for that report. Indigenous leaders in Colombia have announced they will join a national strike called for April 25th. The representatives also vowed to continue their protests while they monitor the progress of the agreement reached with the government on Saturday. Meanwhile, indigenous communities in the department of Putumayo announced roadblocks to demand the government send a separate delegation to negotiate with them. Protests have run for almost a month, demanding the right to land ownership. Our correspondent in Colombia, Tatiana Portela, has the details.
The National Indigenous Organization, UNIC, held a press conference in which Indigenous, Campesino and Afro-descendant leaders talked about the accords they reached with the government. On Saturday night, the group came to a conclusion on issues related to their lands, health and education, among others. As part of the agreements, the communities unblocked the Pan-American Highway after the government promised that President Ivan Duque will visit the area. He's expected to fulfill that promise on Tuesday. In the upcoming meeting, the communities are expected to have discussions on the government's plan for the country and the role the communities will play in it. Indigenous, Campesino and Afro-descendant communities said if the president does not keep his word, they will continue with the social Minga protests. They have also announced that they will take part in a national strike that will take place on April 25th. Labor unions, student associations and other social movements will also join the national strike. The communities said they will strike in order to defend their rights and the peace accords they established with the FARC.
That was Tatiana Portela from Bogota, Colombia. Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has once again said his government is willing to help mediate peaceful dialogue to resolve the political situation gripping Venezuela.
We have proposed that the parties sit down to talk, which is the best thing they can do. To seek a peaceful solution to the political situation, we want a peaceful solution of this dispute. That's the stance of our foreign policy, and we are willing to help for these talks to take place.
This announcement follows a request from Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro, calling on the leaders of Mexico, Uruguay, Bolivia, and the Caribbean to help create a table for dialogue.
I call on the Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, on the President of Uruguay, Tabaré Vázquez, on Bolivian President Evo Morales. I call on the Prime Ministers and Presidents of the 14 CARICOM countries to once again lead the initiative for peaceful dialogue which began in Montevideo 2 months ago. Venezuela asks for support to start a dialogue for peace and understanding between Venezuelans.
And the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza also said the Montevideo mechanism is the most sincere initiative to resolve the political situation in the country, calling for its reactivation. On social media, Arreaza also said that dialogue is the way to solve problems, not violence or war. The new Minister and Vice Minister of Defense have been sworn in Uruguay. Our correspondent in Montevideo, Mateo Grille, tells us more.
This Monday morning, new authorities have been sworn in the Defense Minister after the dismissing of military authorities last week. The new Minister of Defense will be José Bayardi, who already held the position during the first term of President Tabaré Vázquez. Andrés Bertarrecci will be the Vice Minister of Defense. He also served as minister during the presidency of José Mujica. Both of them will head the Ministry of Defense from now on. In addition to this, General Claudio Feola, the Chief of Staff, expressed his loyalty to the new command. Let's recall that this is a unique situation in Uruguay. Last week, the Minister and Vice Minister of Defense were removed along 7 generals. They were sent to retirement after a court disclosed that former army member José Nino Gavazzo was responsible for the disappearance of the left-wing activist Roberto Comensolos in 1973. The authorities from the Defense Minister are currently meeting with the Army's Chief of Staff to plan how to move on in the upcoming days. Trade unions and victims' organizations have called for a march on Thursday to support democracy and to say no to state terrorism.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. At least 10 soldiers are to face trial in Brazil after they opened fire on a car, killing a 51-year-old and prompting protest. Musician Evaldo Rosa dos Santos died on the spot after he was shot 80 times. His wife, 7-year-old son, father-in-law, and a family friend who were also in the vehicle were injured. The military says its officers were responding to a nearby robbery and mistook the car for the criminal's vehicle. Yet one family member says soldiers unleashed the heavy barrage of shots without warning. Thousands mobilized in Brazil to demand freedom for former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, 1 year after he was jailed. Our correspondent Dana Galetti from Curitiba brings us the details.
In various Brazilian cities and across the world, people have taken to the streets and organized gatherings to demand the release of former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Most of these took place on April 7th, which marked the 1-year anniversary of Lula's imprisonment. More than 1,000 people gathered in front of the federal police station of the city of Curitiba, not only to demand his release, but also to oppose President Jair Bolsonaro's latest measures, which target the pension program of Brazil's working class. Therefore, leaders and members of the landless workers' movement are also present to discuss the current political situation, as well as the legal status of Lula. They also demand justice in the murder of Congresswoman Marielle Franco, an end to the pension reform, and support for the agrarian reform.
Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has sacked his education minister Ricardo Vélez Rodrigues. Vélez Rodrigues was criticized over proposed changes to school textbooks, including the denial of the 1964 military coup and disregarding the country's ethnic diversity. Bolsonaro has appointed Abraham Weintraub, an economist and a close associate of the chief of staff. And Bolsonaro is coming under fire from the Macuxi indigenous people, accusing him of giving away their traditional lands to farmers and miners. The Macuxi people won a bloody battle to expel rice planters a decade ago from their reservations, with the backing of the Supreme Court. The Macuxi people fear for their future as large-scale farming has taken over their land for years.
For the new President Jair Bolsonaro, respect our rights. Our land was already demarcated, consolidated, and registered. It took over 30 years, a long process until we got the definition of demarcation, consolidation, and registration for our land. There's no way to revisit Raposa Serra do Sol. I want to ask the government to respect indigenous peoples and respect our constitutional rights.
A Brazilian indigenous leader held an event in France to bring awareness to her people's rights. The head of the Cariri Soco people, Ivanise Pires Danone, said she is concerned about the environmental damage caused by policies created by Bolsonaro's government. She said the destruction of the Amazon jeopardizes the survival of indigenous people.
I am very concerned. I'm worried about our forests, about our rivers that are drying up and becoming more and more polluted and contaminated. I am worried about my indigenous brothers who are falling into depression and dying from diseases unknown to our culture.
Moving on to Costa Rica, violence has increased in indigenous territories since the murder of indigenous leader Sergio Rojas. The details in this report.
Disputes continue in the indigenous territory of Salitre after leader Sergio Rojas was shot 15 times. Ribere indigenous people say they are under attack.
Salitre is experiencing significant violence, with activists being threatened and shot at. People in the community are afraid. After my dad's death, things have only gotten worse.
Persons interested in owning lands within indigenous communities are inciting violence. Some houses are being burnt to the ground. However, many speculate that there is conflict brewing among indigenous people as well.
There is conflict because people assume we don't want other indigenous people within our communities. This is not the case. What we don't want is landowners to enter our territory because they have no legitimate right to do so.
The threats being made are very real. Before Sergio Rojas was murdered, he was threatened. Another leader, Pablo Sivas, coordinator at the Baran Community Council, has also been threatened.
We have received messages and threats through social media saying that we must be killed. They are inciting violence.
Sivas has since criticized the government for its inaction relative to the violence perpetrated against indigenous communities.
We suspect that the person responsible for the violence are all non-indigenous people, or those who own lands inside our territories. They are the ones that are shooting and intimidating us.
An investigation published by the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia has shown that from 2010, at least 118 incidents of violence have been reported, which includes the murder of Sergio Rojas. These crimes are alleged to have been committed by non-indigenous farmers.
It's easy to believe that those responsible for this violence would not resort to these drastic measures if they had documents to prove that they have rights to our lands.
Of the 12,000 hectares of the Salitre territory, 29% of the lands are owned by non-indigenous people, according to the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has signed an agreement with the Mexican government related to the Ayotzinapa students' investigation. Through the agreement, the UN will assist the investigation to solve what happened to the 43 students who went missing in the city of Iguala in 2014.
I celebrate and acknowledge the will of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's government to begin a new era on the Ayotzinapa case, which allows to overcome questions formulated by various national and international organizations toward the investigation made by the extinct Attorney General's Office of the Republic.
A Chilean court has sentenced 4 former members of the intelligence agency to 5 years in prison. The former agents were found guilty of kidnapping and torturing the leader of the revolutionary left movement, Néstor Alfonso Gallardo, in 1974 during the dictatorship. That operation was a plot by the dictatorship to cover up the death of 119 political prisoners. An indigenous community in Guatemala has organized its own marathon. Thousands of Quechua indigenous people from over 100 rural communities gathered to enjoy the event.
Over 500 indigenous athletes competed in this 8th edition of the Cabla Yupur Marathon in the community of Campur in the municipality of Carcha, Alta Verapaz.
It is the first time I see these numbers, because previously, maybe because of the distance, not all the athletes were able to come because of the roads. But now I can see it's getting bigger. Every year more people are competing.
It was a 12 marathon for rural athletes who don't always have the chance to attend big competitions in the country.
It was uphill, but so beautiful. I expect this because it's Campur. It is not easy to compete in Campur. It's fun and it's a pleasure to come here.
According to the organizers, every year the number of participants increases, especially the numbers of teachers and students.
We are motivating ourselves, our spirit, through sports. It is a way to stay young and have a healthy lifestyle, with values, sports and music instead of bad habits.
The event was launched in 2011 in the community of Campur. It was aimed at fighting crime in the region.
At the beginning, we called it Marathon for Peace because the region was highlighted as a dangerous place. We wanted to change that picture, promoting sports within our youth.
But organizers say that despite the success of the event, they only get support from local businessmen and not from the government.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The South African government has downgraded the level of its embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel, which will now hold a liaison office status. This was an act of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Our correspondent in South Africa, Matoba Malachi, explains.
The South African government has implemented what International Relations Minister Lindiwe Sisulu calls stage one of a process of downgrading relations with Israel. That stage one started with withdrawing its ambassador from Tel Aviv permanently. It happened last week, and the minister says it's possible that Israel may end up without an ambassador here in South Africa. The South African Communist Party, meanwhile, has congratulated the government for its move, saying it was long overdue. The governing party, the ANC, agreed at its 2017 conference to downgrade its relations with Israel. The implementation of this resolution started after Israeli security forces shot Palestinian protesters on the Israel-Gaza border in 2018. That's when Pretoria immediately recalled South Africa's ambassador to Israel, Sisa Ngombane, for consultation. But we know now that it's for good and he's never going back. The Israeli government, through its embassy here in South Africa, says it won't comment on what has happened. And civil society organizations like BDSSA have welcomed this move. South Africa is a politically active Jewish community, and this will certainly create debate in the country, especially now ahead of the much anticipated elections in May. It's back to you, studio.
We thank Matuwa for that report. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame has said his country will not force any individual or nation to apologize for their role in the 1994 genocide. Rwanda commemorated the victims of the genocide during the weekend, marking its 25th anniversary.
You can't ask people to apologize or keep asking them to apologize or tell them how to apologize. Then that, after all, kills the whole meaning of an apology. For an apology to have a meaning, it must come from somebody who is apologizing.
A Brunei national who identifies himself as a gay man has spoken out against the new measures implemented in the country that punish homosexuality. The new Islamic Sharia also punishes adultery. The penalty for both crimes is to be stoned to death. The Sharia has caused international outrage with a boycott campaign against hotels owned by Brunei. The LGBTQ community is pleading for help.
I'm not sure what's worse, act like we are non-existent to the world, or act like we are not, or hurt us even more, or condemn us for being who we are, because we're not something that in their religion are acceptable.
The final touches at the exhibit of the tomb of ancient Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun have been made before the Grand Egyptian Museum opens in 2020. Egypt is preparing its collection of Tutankhamun artifacts before the planned opening of the museum. The ancient works will be displayed in the biggest room of the museum. Students in Barcelona, Spain have taken to the streets to demand action against climate change, as experts warn that the issue is turning into a major emergency. More in this report.
Students of all ages took to the streets of Barcelona, Spain to protest against climate change and to demand immediate actions to change its course. Their fight brings hope to many.
I have been told that by the time I'm 30, the planet as we know it won't exist anymore, and that our extinction is expected to happen by 2100. I will be 89 years old. The radar won't be pretty. They are telling me that I have no future, and that is forcing me to take action.
These students are joining the Fridays for Future movement, launched by young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. The movement has expanded all across the world.
We can reduce our environmental footprint by not buying so many plastic bottles, by not using cars and instead using a bike or walking, by using public transport.
One day after these protests, 50 environmental experts concluded that climate change is a social emergency. During a 12-hour session, each expert exposed their arguments.
Temperature has risen by 1 degree already, and we are not doing anything. Each degree has a huge impact.
We need to react before the situation becomes irreversible. We have to maintain the current temperature. This is forcing us to take action.
Experts have said that industrialized countries need to reduce their carbon emissions and that they start helping other countries in this fight.
Reducing carbon emissions has been a trend that was introduced during the past few years, especially in regards to emerging countries, such as those belonging to the BRICS bloc, among them China and Brazil.
Experts say we need to rethink our economic system and avoid models that are only benefiting a few by abusing our limited resources.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesorenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.